Our fascination with the world's highest peak seems unending. For some, Everest is an inspiring adventure. For others, just a bucket list destination. The focus on the mountain in the media creates a public perception that every mountaineer considers Everest the ultimate goal. The obsession began with British ambition in the early 1900s to be the first to reach the summit of the third pole, having failed on both the South and North Poles. Even at the time, some mountaineers and a few newspapers saw this as a fatal attraction. In this film, 100 years after the disappearance of Mallory and Irvine high on the mountain, we examine the characters, motives and value of expeditions to Everest, then and now.
I think if you look at newspapers now reporting on Everest, and you see the pictures of the queues and the millions of tents, and some of the controversies that have haunted the mountain in recent years, you kind of look back to Mallory and Irvine and you think that is just a glorious, innocent age, and life was more simple, and what have we done to the place? But if you look closely, then all the things that kind of concern us now were there right at the beginning. The reason the Everest expeditions were so large and kind of well-funded and complicated was because there was, so much diplomacy around getting them into the field. It required, a major effort of kind of imperial magnitude to actually get them to the mountain. And that position of Everest on the front line, if you like, is just the same now. And as the mountain has grown in significance and importance culturally, its political significance has increased too. So that while people barely knew where it was in the 1920s, and even within Tibet, there are much more holy mountains. After Mallory and Irvine and the expeditions of the 30s and the first ascent in 53, it was globally famous, and there were political consequences.
In 1856, a team of surveyors led by the Indian mathematician Radhanath Sikdar calculated that a distant peak, designated Peak 15, was the highest in the world. Within a year, the mountain was named after George Everest. Everest happened to be the British Surveyor General of India when the peak's height was established. George Everest and influential mountaineers like Alexander Kellis argued the mountain should be given a local name following standard protocol. The mountain had many local names. In Tibet, Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world. In Nepal, Sagarmatha, the head of the great blue sky. But in an example of misplaced colonialism, the now mispronounced name Everest stuck. For the expeditions in the 1920s, the name did not matter. They first had to find it, then to climb it. Sandy Irvine's great niece, Julie Summers, asked Stephen Venables to give some background to those early expeditions.
Now we all travel to Nepal, we take it for granted. In the early 20th century, foreigners weren't allowed into Nepal. So it wasn't possible to get to the mountain from Nepal. And on the other side is Tibet, which was also a virtually closed land.
So how did it come about that the British actually did manage to get permission to go into Tibet?
Various people had been sniffing around Everest, trying to think, how can we get to it? Charles Bruce, who ended up leading one of the first Everest expeditions. Douglas Freshfield himself got really interested in Everest. And Younghusband, the great explorer Younghusband, he also was very enthusiastic about the idea of an Everest expedition. Most important of all, Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India, the man with the real power, he thought that climbing Everest would be a really good idea. So that there were these big political players keen that a British expedition should go to Everest.
In November 1919, a year after the end of the First World War, Captain John Knoll presented a lecture at the Royal Geographical Society. Knoll had tried to reach the mountain in disguise in 1913, but was discovered only 40 miles short. His lecture fired up the members of the Society and of the Alpine Club to climb the mountain. Together, they formed the Mount Everest Committee. Its objective? To plan the immense task of climbing the highest mountain in the world. We hear Dawson Stelfox, first Irishman to climb Everest, discuss the objectives of the 1921 expedition.
So it was very much a surveying expedition. The weight of the team was more surveying the ground, land surveying, botanical surveying, understanding the countryside. And the climbing party was relatively small. And of course, George Mallory was there. George Mallory went on through, the only person who went on through the first three expeditions, but primarily to find the mountain.
And it was a success in that respect.
It was enormously, you could argue it's the most successful of those early Everest expeditions because it achieved all its aims. So not only did they map a vast area in broad terms, they mapped the particular area around Everest in very great detail. They found a feasible route. Took them a while, but inevitably because of the complications of the countryside, they found a feasible climbing route to it, and they got to the North Col and then up to try the mountain itself. So remarkable achievements, really.
But these were not bumbling amateur gentlemen, were they? These were men with enormous experience of the area.
They had, I would say at the time, they probably had more experience than most contemporary expeditions going to Everest in terms of travelling in remote countryside and being self-sufficient out in these wild sort of expanses, finding their way, particularly that whole thing of surveying. Nowadays, we don't survey anything, we don't discover anything really. We follow in the footsteps of all these generations.
The expeditions in the 1920s had many fascinating and multi-talented individuals. Charles Bruce spoke 17 local dialects. Edward Norton and Howard Somerville were both talented painters. Somerville was a doctor and surgeon who had chosen to live in India. He was the first artist to recycle waste materials from expeditions, using the brown paper packing as the canvases for many of his watercolours. These early expeditions were moments of transition that would shape the way the great mountains of the world were approached and recorded to the present day, not just in the arts, film and photography, but also in science. Alexander Kellis made 10 first ascents with Sherpa companions of peaks over 6,100 metres, including Pahun Ri. At 7,128 metres, it was the highest climbed peak until Kamet in 1931. Sadly, Kellis died of severe dysentery on the 1921 approach. We asked Dr. Melanie Windridge to tell us about this remarkable man.
Alexander Kellis, he was a chemist, and he was also a pioneering Himalayan climber. I think in 1920 he had climbed more Himalayan peaks than anybody else, so he had a lot of experience out there, and in doing that he'd become aware of the effect that altitude has on the human body. And because of his background in chemistry and particularly working with oxygen, he was able to analyse this, and so he had a better understanding than many people about what would be required to actually climb Mount Everest. This is the paper by Alexander Kellis from 1920, a consideration of the possibility of ascending Mount Everest. And it's fascinating because he really looks into the problems of altitude. He's got these things, the process of acclimatization at altitude, increase of oxygen pressure in the alveolar air. He's really thinking about the human physiology and what's happening to the body and what this means for climbing Everest. Like, how high can a human actually climb? Back then, and actually still today, many people think about mountaineering as like the strength of the human spirit and not so much about the science that enables us to do these kind of things.
One thing is for certain, climbers in the 1920s, just as on the commercial expeditions today, would not have got far without the high altitude workers from Nepal and Tibet, the tigers of the snows, as they were dubbed by the British climbers. In 1922, Colonel Bruce ensured the entire expedition received the blessing of Zatul Rinpoche at the Rongbuk Monastery. He told the Rinpoche that the British Alpine Club climbers were members of a cult of mountain worshippers, an example of Bruce's humour. but with more than an element of truth. The Rinpoche gave his blessing, but warned them not to disturb the demons of the mountain. The warning would be to no avail, as 7 Sherpas were killed in a disastrous avalanche on a final push up the North Col as the monsoon broke. Was this summit fever, as we call it today, or an example of collateral damage common across the British Empire during the imperial era? The continuing loss of Sherpas working on Everest seems to be history repeating itself.
There are lots of aspects of these expeditions that are questionable. The death of porters in 1922 shouldn't have happened, really. They knew enough for that not to have happened, that's the truth. It's very uncomfortable in a way because people venerate these guys, but those porters shouldn't have died.
Mallory rightly blamed his poor judgment for the accident. Somerville wrote that it would have been better if some of the Sahibs had shared the fate of the Sherpas. It seems likely that the hierarchical nature of the empire meant that Sherpas and boatiers were not always treated as equals. But the Tigers of the Snows greatly impressed all the climbing party, who, perhaps overestimating their strength and ability, placed them at increased risk. Dr. Jonathan Westaway from the University of Central Lancashire has done extensive research into the local members of these early expeditions, as Julie discovers.
Do you have a sense that the climbers or the expedition organisers had a sense of duty of care towards the porters and the Sherpas?
I think on the whole they were of their time. This is a racially hierarchical and very structured society in British India. There are clear distinctions between what they would refer to as the whites, and sometimes they refer to them in the dispatches as the Himalayans or, our high altitude porters.
So have you found evidence that people went on multiple expeditions and built up expertise and therefore respect within the British climbing community?
There's evidence there were people who went on all 3 Everest expeditions in the 1920s. So Gyaltsen Sirdar, who was a labour contractor in Darjeeling and managed a lot of the pack animals on the expeditions in 1921, 22 and 23. The great example, of course, is Karma Paul, who was on all the expeditions from 1922 to 1938. But there was considerable reliance on local intermediaries, particularly people with Tibetan language skills. So in 1921, on the reconnaissance expedition, there were 2 interpreters, Gyaltsen Kazi and Chetan Wangdu. And these people acted as important intermediaries who negotiated the cultural differences that were encountered by the expeditions and were very important in terms of recruiting labour and managing labour.
Dr. Westaway mentions Karma Paul and Gyaltsen Kazi. Like Mallory, they were part of all 3 of the expeditions in the 1920s, seen here together. Gyaltsen Kazi came from a rich landlord family in Sikkim. The term Kazi is an honorific title, indicating his high status. British expedition records reveal that he was well read in Tibetan scriptures and could speak English and possibly Nepali. Karma Paul, who lost his parents young, received an education from evangelists in Darjeeling. His name was changed from Palden to Paul, as it was easier for the missionaries to pronounce. Although he received the catechism, Karma remained a devout Buddhist all his life, and was crucial to negotiating the blessing at Rongbuk in 1922 and 1924. None in the British teams in those 3 years knew much Tibetan, so Gyaltsen Kazi and Karma Paul became the bridge between the Tibetans and the British climbers.
Did the Sherpas and the high altitude porters have the same objective as the British climbing teams? Was there a real interest within that community in achieving something of getting up high into the mountain and perhaps even up to the summit?
I think the simple answer is no. Most of the indigenous workforce were recruited in Darjeeling. Darjeeling was a transcultural kind of ethnic zone that pulled in labour from across the region, from Nepal, Assam, Sikkim, even from Tibet. People were there because within the British Empire there was incredible need for kind of infrastructural labour. in building roads, bridges, drains and stuff like that. There was a tourist industry, there were the railways. So it sucked in a pool of cheap labour, and the people who were recruited on these expeditions were very clear about their motivations. You know, they did it for money.
Although money was a factor, some Sherpas clearly enjoyed the challenge of expeditions and came back time and again. For example, Ang Sering joined the 1924 expedition at the age of 20. He became a legend and role model in Nepal. He was awarded a Tiger Badge for his role in the 1952 Swiss Everest expedition and continued climbing well into his 60s. Then, as now, expeditions were expensive. The Everest Committee organised a massive new expedition in 1924, more confident than ever of success, and with an equally confident financial backer, John Knoll, the man whose lecture in 1919 led to the Everest expeditions that followed. Knoll had filmed the 1922 attempt and was so convinced of success in 1924 he mortgaged his house and formed a company to raise capital. The Mount Everest Committee agreed with Knoll a sum of £8,000 for the rights to the photographs and film of the expedition, more than £600,000 today, or $750,000 US, and 90% of the funds needed for the expedition. Competition for a place on the 1924 expedition was fierce. One choice that surprised many was the inclusion of a 22-year-old Oxford Blue rower, Sandy Irvine, whose climbing experience was limited to one trip to Spitsbergen and some Alpine ascents. Mallory and Irvine travelled together on the SS California to Bombay, then across India by train, finally arriving in Darjeeling in late March to join the rest of the team. Bruce described Irvine as our splendid experiment. He possessed a remarkable handiness and adaptability as a practical working engineer. This, combined with infinite unselfishness, made Irvine a very great asset to our party. The 350-mile route to base camp was long and hard. Sun, wind and sand turned Irvine's face into a blistered war zone. Personal equipment suffered, and most of the climbers took advantage of Sandy's repairing skills in his workshop surgery. Along the route, he repaired Mallory's bed, Beetham's camera, Odell's tripod, and Knoll's cine camera. Most important was his work on the oxygen equipment. The improvements he recommended to the manufacturers to lighten the apparatus and make it more climber-friendly had been completely ignored. He rebuilt all the sets with limited tools, finally finishing the Mark V version in base camp at the end of April.
When people ask me why do you think George Mallory chose Sandy Irvine to be his climbing partner, I think there are three overarching reasons. The first is his ability with the oxygen apparatus, which was relatively newfangled, and he'd spent a lot of time working on it, so he knew how it functioned, and Mallory trusted him. The second reason was that Sandy Irvine, as an ex-oarsman, was exceptionally strong, and he knew how to push himself through the pain barrier and to carry on. And the third reason was characteristics. He was relatively quiet. He was deferential to Mallory, not only because of his age, but because of his enormous climbing experience. And there is no way that Sandy Irvine ever would have questioned Mallory's climbing judgments. He would have climbed in support, and he would have given his all because he really believed in Mallory's vision for getting to the summit of Everest.
At the beginning of May, the climbers and porters began to establish higher camps. Norton worried that the monsoon was arriving early. For 2 weeks, blizzard conditions hampered progress. A modern weather forecast would have identified a low-pressure system moving in from the Hindu Kush, and climbers would be advised to sit tight. Without this knowledge, the climbers pushed on according to schedule, aiming for the summit on May 27th. In the extreme cold, the porters began to suffer. Some simply went home, others were given extra wages and food to stay. There were casualties. The Gurkha NCO Shamshir died of what was certainly cerebral edema before he could be brought down to base camp from Camp 3, while the expedition cobbler, Man Bahadur, suffered frostbite in hands and feet and died a week later. On May 13th, everyone retreated to base camp. With the porters completely demoralised, Norton sent Karma Paul down to the Rongbuk Monastery to arrange a blessing for the expedition. Every porter was given rice and a few coins as offerings. The blessing heightened their spirits, and the weather improved. John Knoll wrote, "This retreat is only a temporary setback. The next time we walk up the Rongbuk will be the last. We will gather our resources and advance to the last assault." Mallory wrote in his last letter to his wife Ruth on May the 27th, "It is 50-1 against us, but we'll have a whack yet and do ourselves proud. Great love to you, ever your loving, George." What was Mallory like? He was clearly driven by the thought of climbing Everest. When asked by a journalist in America why anyone would climb the mountain, he famously replied, "Because it is there." In the words of poet Franz Wölfel, "For those who believe, no explanation is necessary. For those who do not believe, no explanation is possible." Mallory was well liked by many who came to know him, and respected by those who knew him well. Howard Somervell wrote, "His outlook on life was lofty and choice. He was really only concerned with social evils and recognised that these could only be solved by the changing and ennobling of human character." In the months before Everest, Mallory had a public face of belief and confidence. But in a letter to Geoffrey Keynes, he confided, "This is going to be more like war than mountaineering. I don't expect to come back." As climbing leader, Mallory decided that Norton and Somervell would make the first summit attempt without oxygen. They set out on June the 6th at 6:30 a.m. Somervell was forced to give up at around 8,400 metres, but Norton carried on alone and reached the great gully that leads enticingly to the final summit pyramid. He was at 8,570 metres, less than 1,000 feet from the summit. But he knew it was too late in the day, and he turned back. On June the 8th, George Mallory set out for the summit with his less experienced but immensely strong and innovative partner, Sandy Irvine. They never returned.
I was about 7 when my father first told me about the mystery of Sandy Irvine's disappearance on Everest in 1924. Naturally, he was a family legend. I think it's very easy to treat history as something that leaps out of the pages of picture books, but actually every single story of an individual, whether on an expedition or in war or on an adventure, it's the story of an individual who has a family. And when there's a loss, it's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples affect the wider family. And of course, my great-grandmother was devastated at the loss of her son. And of course, Willie Irvine, my great-grandfather, felt the pain of his loss. But he also felt a great sense of pride in being part of the history. And when the Everest Expedition came back and John Knoll showed the wonderful photographs, there was a shot of Sandy's rope ladder, which he had built between Camp 3 and Camp 4 to help the porters. And my great-grandfather had that hanging in his study for the rest of his life. And I have a son called Sandy, and it's now in his room at home.
Julie asked Chris Bonington what he thought of Mallory and his thoughts on Sandy as his partner.
I think Mallory, he was a total climber. And in that way, I mean, I can empathise with him in so many different ways, because he was just climbing for the sheer thrill of climbing, but also with a great awareness of what was around him as well. Maybe if he'd teamed himself with one of the very strongest of the climbers, things might have been different.
Mallory wrote 2 final letters at Camp 5 at 27,000 feet, one for Odell and one to Knoll, which is intriguing, as Rebecca Stevens explains.
This is written from Camp 6, and I think it's completely fascinating, because what it shows is that there is another possibility that he may not have climbed the ridge line as people suspect, but he may have taken a lower line. And that opens up the possibility that he actually missed out the second step altogether. So, you know, there's a lot of focus on could he have climbed the second step, because it was very technical, and we know that Irvine wasn't such a proficient climber as Mallory was. But I will read this to you because it opens up all sorts of possibilities. It doesn't answer any questions, I'm afraid. There's still the mystery there. But let me just read it for you here. It says here, Dear Noel, we'll probably start early tomorrow morning on the 8th in order to have a clear weather. It won't be too early to start looking out for us, either crossing the rock band under the pyramid or going up the skyline at 8 p.m. Yours ever, George Mallory. Now, the 8 p.m. is well acknowledged to be a mistake. It was actually 8 a.m. that he meant. But the thing is, did he go on the skyline? And here it's suggesting that he was already thinking about an alternative. It was really interesting because I was actually talking to Bill Norton, who is our one link back to the 1920s, who of course was the son of Edward Norton. And he said to me that as Norton and Mallory were walking across the Tibetan Plateau, they had lengthy discussions and some differing views on which route to take. And Mallory definitely wanted to take the skyline, and Norton wanted to take the lower line below the ridge. And they had a disagreement about that essentially. But we know that actually Norton and Somerville did take the lower line. And they got incredibly high. I mean, over 28,000 feet. That's within 1,000 feet of the summit.
But this contradicts the one possible sighting of the two climbers made by Noel O'Dell from near Camp 5.
And the clouds were about. In fact, there was quite a lot of heavy mist round about the upper part. But there was a clearing, almost like a window. And gazing up, I saw two figures making their way up a snow slope towards a rock feature in the ridge that led up to the final pyramid of the mountain. And these two figures were moving one at a time, and one made his ascent up to this rock step, as we called it, and then seemed to appear at the top. I imagine that would be Mallory. And then, unfortunately, the clouds came down and obscured them, and I never saw them again.
In 2007, Conrad Anker and I climbed Everest to make a film about the story of Mallory and Irvine called The Wildest Dream. And we had equipment identical to this, replicas of the 24 kit that we wore up to just shy of 8,000 meters.
So how did it perform? Because it looks very old-fashioned.
It's much better than you would imagine. What you can't see is how many layers I've got on here. There's, I believe it was 7 layers that they had on the top. This outer gabardine first, which is really wind resistant. The main insulation was various layers of merino wool, which we still use today, silk, and a heavy felt.
And you're clutching a very, very famous object. What is it?
This is Irvine's actual ice axe, the one that he had with him on that fateful summit attempt. Those 3 notches there were the 3 notches that he put on all his kit to identify it, and this was found in 1933 way high on the mountain. It's remarkably light, and yeah, what a privilege, what a thing to imagine that that's what he was holding on to on that day.
So on that day, they got to the second step. We've discussed this in great detail many times over. That is the crux of the climb, and it's the question that you have to answer. Did they get to the top or not?
In my mind, there's no question that the second step is the crux of the story. If they overcame the obstacle of the second step, I'm pretty sure they got to the top. However, the second step is a formidable obstacle. It's by far the most difficult section of that line on Everest by a country mile. The rest of the climb is terrain that you don't really need to use your hands on. Today we use walking poles, or you'd use a walking axe. There's a couple of sections where you have to use your hands a little bit, and then all of a sudden you're faced with a 15-foot vertical cliff, a bit like this room that we're stood in here. Now, 15 foot isn't a lot, but if you don't have the means to overcome it, it's a showstopper. You can't climb an overhanging corner that's 15 foot high. If I was a betting man, I would have to say I would bet against them having reached the summit. I just think they were in such extremis to that point, to then face something that's so drastically more difficult than any other obstacle they'd encountered. I just think it would have been a very imprudent decision to do that. However, it is possible. So in a nutshell, I think it's improbable, but possible that they got to the top.
And so would you ever want anybody to find Sandy's body?
For me, the beauty of this story, and well, for everyone, the reason we're stood here talking about it now, Julie, is because we just don't know, and there's something so compelling and evocative about that mystery of not knowing what happened, and there's all kinds of conjecture and theories. I've got my own, I'm sure you've got yours, and but personally, I hope we never find your great uncle Irvine. I hope we don't find the camera, and I hope that the mystery endures for another century.
Another factor that makes their summit unlikely was a ferocious storm that blew in for several hours in the afternoon. So why are people still attracted to the heights of the Himalaya? Surely it's more than just a moment of fame or excitement. We hear from Ed Douglas, Melanie Windridge and Rebecca Stevens.
Most alpinists, most mountaineers are fascinated by the Himalaya as a kind of sporting objective. And, as a young'un, you kind of want to get there in some shape or form. It took me slightly too long in some ways, but I did get there. And then my head was just full of questions because the complexity of it was overwhelming. And I wanted to try and understand that because that's just in my nature. I mean, people are the most interesting thing of all. And I'm very interested in how mountains shape culture and how they shape people.
Sunrise on the summit of Mount Everest. Isn't this incredible?
It was such a privilege for me to be there. It was wonderful. I think having read so much about Everest and the places, the scenery, to feel like I was just really walking in the footsteps of some of these people that I've read about was incredible.
In some ways, nothing's changed. I have the same photographs taken, decades later, but the landscape doesn't change very much. The odd little rock falling here or there, but otherwise, incredibly recognisable, and it carries so much of that history. And I'm sure everybody at the Alpine Club feels similar. Many people have been to Everest, and I've been incredibly fortunate to have visited it from the north the first time, climb it from the south, and then trek to the east. So I look at the map and, I know all the glaciers that run off it and all the different ridges and things, and it's just a great feeling. It was a very special place, it always will be.
A 100 years on, Everest holds little interest for many alpinists seeking new routes and exploratory adventure. Here are the views of Alpine Club President Simon Richardson and Ed Douglas again.
So Everest is part of our heritage, part of our history, something that we're very proud of. But we've moved on. We're focused on mountain exploration, we're focused on pushing new routes in great style, exploring new parts of the world that nobody's ever been to. I mean, some people said that we get Everest climbed, we can get back to the real climbing, and I think that's very true.
A lot of climbers would feel Everest is not much to do with them. I mean, first of all, it's so expensive, so there's a certain kind of person who wants to climb it. It's a prestige good, like a sports car or a super yacht or whatever. Because climbers are really complicated too. We just see them as one kind of thing, but they're not. You can be doing the same activity with a completely different motivation, and unless you can look inside their minds, you don't know that. So I've met, Himalayan climbers who say, if I could go to the mountains in a bubble, I would, because they're not interested.
Krish Thapa was born near Annapurna in a traditional Gurkha area and is a highly experienced mountain guide and spiritual practitioner who served in the British Army for 30 years. We asked Krish what the mountains mean to him.
I think this is a very profound question personally on my journey. I grown up as a childhood worshipping the mountain. Still today, Nepal is the only country in the world, 90% population, still believe in some sort of, spirit or energy, and one of them being a mountain. And sadly, we are definitely losing the worshipping the mountain, worshipping the blue sky, worshipping the tree, and connection with the nature, and subtle energy, actually the force of Gurkha. That's what we call today the energy behind us. I lost my grandfather in Second World War. My parents had a dream for me to join the Gurkha before I even born. So I served my parents' dream in a way. And I used to see these white British guys walking through my village for the Annapurna circuit. I realized I was fascinating. Why these white people come from all the way other side of the ocean and walking in this mountain? I couldn't put my head around.
In May 2023, along with his brother and close friends, Krish led double amputee Harry Buddha Marga to reach the summit. Krish reflects on what many may miss when climbing Everest.
I think if anything, we need to learn from the climbing the mountain or Everest is to see and reflect what actually mountain try to teach us about our own life within, and that we can only realize through hard work and through the present and passion and the silence. But also respect, nature is always there before us and it's always there after we're gone.
Ed Douglas looks back one last time to those first pioneering Everest expeditions.
Although, we tend to think that Everest is kind of somehow more complicated and more cynical and more and less illustrious than it used to be, I think we really need to look back at these expeditions with a more honest eye, because these are not kind of simple heroic people. These are people with the same motivations and the same concerns and the same complexities as we have. And they weren't always honorable, they weren't always perfect. The thing that you want to admire about them most is their tremendous kind of courage and optimism that this could work, because you just look at what they had and what they were faced with, and that sense that they could do this is actually unbelievably inspiring.
Everest is so much more than just the world's highest mountain. For the Himalayan communities around its base, it is an important industry, attracting thousands of mountain tourists each year. Hundreds reach its summit. Who are we to say who should and should not go there? That is a matter for the Nepalese to decide, but we are right to ask for good behaviour and to recognise that as tourists we are guests in a sacred land. The Everest expeditions in the 1920s started a complex legacy of development and exploitation, of amazing climbs and sadly many fatalities. Everest is a place of changing values, both good and bad. To reach the highest point on our planet is at once a measure of our ambition and achievement, and at the same time of our frailties and vanity. The allure of the world's highest mountain is still with us. When news arrived that the partial remains of Sandy Irvine had been found, I asked Julie Summers for her thoughts. She said, "The discovery of Sandy's boot, sock and foot by National Geographic's team, led by filmmaker Jimmy Chin, was handled with sensitivity and respect. The find is archaeological evidence. If his mortal remains are ever found, I hope that his body will be left where it is found and covered, if that is physically possible. Many will hope the mystery will remain. It is part of Everest's legacy. Where did the accident happen? Did they reach the summit? Because Everest is there, Mallory and Irving were there together. The highest men on earth for a short time. A long time ago in human terms, but not for Chomolungma.